Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Toxic Mold Sucks. This is one of our expert episodes. I'm Elizabeth Kripe, Executive Director and co-founder of Malachi's Message. Today, co-hosting is Emily Rochelle, our co-founder of Malachi's Message and board chair. We have the unique privilege of speaking with Tim, and I'm probably going to butcher your last name. So
everybody does.
Swackhmmer.
It's easier than it sounds like it'll be. It's just like it reads, Swackhmmer.
Swackhmmer. All right.
Yep.
There we go. And Tim, I'm just going to go with Tim if that's okay, is the founder and
Perfect.
CEO of Mold Medics and Mold Medics Franchising. Mold Medics is dedicated to helping people improve the environmental quality of their homes through mold remediation, air duct cleaning, radon mitigation, and other environmental services. They're also proud to offer franchise opportunities currently available across the U.S. And we're going to kind of get into why Mold Medics to start with in a minute. But thank you for coming on. I'm so glad you reached out. We've enjoyed our conversation so far, and we're excited to share this conversation with our listeners.
Yeah, me too. Thank you guys very much for having me. I really love what you guys are doing, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Tim, it's so good to meet you. How long have you been doing this? How long have you been in the industry?
So we've been in the industry for about 8 years, give or take. And it's really been a very interesting journey. As we were talking about a little bit beforehand, we originally got started sort of in-home services and just kind of fell into the space that we ended up being in with mold, and specifically working with mold sensitive individuals and people who have suffered from things like chronic inflammatory response symptoms, the response syndrome, there we go. And it's been very interesting as we've gotten down this, finding all of the people that really weren't being helped by a lot of the companies that were out there. Most of the companies that were in sort of the mold and environmental space are typically your insurance beholden restoration contractors. So your serve pros, your service masters, and they're very property focused. They're working in most cases directly for the insurance companies when you have a big loss. And we realized pretty quickly that there wasn't anyone serving people. So serving people who are suffering from long-term issues, who a lot of the issues that we're dealing with that contribute to the mold aren't via some major water loss. They're not from major flooding or anything like that. They're from some flaws in the building construction. They're from issues with the maintenance or upkeep of the home. That just go unaddressed for a while and can create an issue that can really, really impact the health of the occupants. So we thought it was absolutely necessary to be able to have solutions for people that are going through these things that really aren't getting them right now.
So my family, something that stood out to me, because my daughter and I are both chemically sensitive, when we were talking about how you guys serve people, you guys have really taken it an extra step in regards to even your staff and what they do when they're going into a chemically sensitive home. Can you explain to us just the extra steps you guys have taken to ensure that those people are in a safe space?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, whenever we're working with somebody who has chemical sensitivity, number one, there's not a lot of contractors out there who even attempt to understand what they're going through. So we really recognize that need and have taken some steps to make sure that we're meeting it. So one of the things that we do, we have shower facilities on site, and we provide our technicians with free and clear detergents for clothing, so they can make sure that they're not tracking any chemicals or fragrances that are on their clothing into the home, as well as different body care products to make sure that they're not using heavily fragranced deodorants and perfumes or things like that, that could potentially trigger somebody who's chemically sensitive. So we want to make sure that we're always presenting that to customers who do have those sensitivities, and also recognizing that through pretty much any mold remediation process, there's going to be some level of chemical involvement, which this is where things get really, really tricky. A lot of companies are very specific with, we use X product or we use Y product, or there's some of them out there that use magic pixie dusts that are going to eliminate everything. And that's sort of what they build their company around. We, on the other hand, we have a variety of different products available. We do try to identify the safest ones possible, but we'll also, if we have somebody who's chemically sensitive, we'll provide them samples of the various products that we can use so they can see if they have reactions to any of them, or which ones they prefer. So they have those options available rather than just, yeah, this is what we're going to use and we're going to spray all over your house. We also, even in the choice in the equipment that we use. So originally, whenever we started out, we were using a standard ULV sprayer or an ultra low volume sprayer, which just basically produces product at a very fine mist. We've since switched to fully electrostatic sprayers because they're able to basically use a significantly lower amount of product, but because of the way it charges the particles when they come out, it adheres to the surface better. So we end up getting less chemicals in the air. We get more chemical on the surface where it's able to do what it needs to do without us having to coat as thick. So we're introducing a whole lot less into the environment and getting a better result from that.
That is really cool, Tim, that you offer that to your clients, because so many people that go through mold, they weren't chemically sensitive beforehand, but now they are. And so to be able to provide those options, that is just so valuable to those people. What do you find, I'm curious, what do you find that is causing all this mold growth in your clients' homes? Like, what are the main culprits?
Yeah, so I mean, we are specifically, and a lot of these things can be regional, but there's some that are pretty universal. So I like to generally start with talking about the outside issues and work our way in, because obviously whenever we're talking about mold, at the end of the day, we're talking about water intrusion. There's got to be some sort of water to cause the mold growth. We always say mold needs food, it needs air, it needs temperature, it needs all those things to continue to grow, and it needs water. And the downside is the only one we can control is the water, because the food source for mold is going to be plant material. That's what mold's job is. It is breaking down dead plant material. The downside is we build our homes pretty much exclusively out of dead plant material. So all of the wood, all of the drywall has paper backing to it. I mean, so many of the different products that we utilize in homes are potential food sources for mold. So we can't really control the food. We can't control the air because we need to breathe too. We can't control the temperature because it grows at the same temperature range we like. So we have to control the water. So if we start at the outside, some of the first thing I'm going to look at whenever I'm looking at the outside of a home that I know has a potential mold issue, I'm going to look at the gutters. I'm going to look at the downspouts, and I'm going to look at where is that water going whenever there's rain, because that's what's going to contribute the most moisture to the outside of our home is substantial rains, particularly around here. We get them in the spring and the summer, big thunderstorms, that kind of thing that can just put down a ton of rain. And the gutters and the downspouts are going to be the first places I'm going to look, because in a lot of cases, what will happen is the gutters will be not cleaned properly. They'll be old and not hung well. So they're just kind of hanging off there. And what can happen is the water will just straight up overflow and run down the side of the house, where it can potentially permeate through cracks in the window or cracks and caulking around the windows, siding, any of those issues. But then it really starts to accumulate at the foundation. And that's where we see a lot of the issues come in with exterior water, is foundation water that just slowly wicks into the house. And the more water you have, generally the faster it's going to come through. So we want to make sure that water is being controlled. And what you should see is good gutters around the house that direct all of the water that's coming off the roof. They go into the gutter, they go down the downspout, and then that's safely discharged away from the home. So if the gutters are working fine and they're directing it to the downspouts, then we look at the downspouts. Are they working correctly? Are they hooked up? Probably the most common thing we see is the downspout will come down the side of the house, and where it should be going underground to a pipe that discharges somewhere else, or there will be like a 90-degree elbow that takes it and runs it off at least 6 feet or so away from the foundation. That elbow or whatever is disconnected, and the downspouts just dropping everything right at the corner of the foundation. And the problem with this is that's actually worse than having no gutters at all, because at least if you have no gutters, the rain's going to shed off the roof evenly all around the foundation. But now we've taken and we've directed it all to just a couple spots where the downspouts come down, And during a big rainstorm, it's just pouring gallons and gallons and gallons of water right at that foundation. That's eventually going to make its way into the foundation of the home and into the basement, and boom, now we've got a mold issue. So gutters and downspouts are two of the biggest things that we like to look at whenever we start out.
That's really interesting. I don't think I've ever thought about looking at, I know my husband and I have talked when we've looked at building a home, making sure you look at the gutters, but it's always been looking at the spouts, not at the bottom. Like, yeah, if everything dumping out at the bottom, that's just a logical conclusion that not a lot of people are going to think through.
Yep. And it's really common.
My son's school, that was one of my arguments with them. I mean, you walked out of the front doors because his school had a bad mold problem. And just like you said, Tim, the downspouts were right at the foundation. And like every time it rained, you just puddles of water would be sitting there and accumulating at the foundation. Not only that, the weed poles were right there too.
Yep.
And so I asked them to test that wall. Of course they wouldn't, but yes, you're absolutely correct there. That is a huge issue.
Yep. And then as we kind of go down from there, grading of the soil is a big one too. So just like we want to have the downspouts, they should be coming in directing water. Ideally, we want to see at least 6 feet away from the foundation. The grading of the soil around the home should also be sloped away so that whenever rain hits the side of the home, it's going to run down. We want it to roll off and away from the foundation. And what we see over time, that rain runoff is just going to accumulate and it's going to slowly erode the soil, and it will end up sloping back towards the foundation. And now we've got water that's being directed towards the foundation, which again, it's going to just seep back in and begin to cause a problem. So the only real other exterior issues that we look at are really basic maintenance stuff. So, and it's stuff that tends to get ignored by even some of the most prudent homeowners, but caulking. It's not just an aesthetic thing. I mean, yes, it does make your house look better. It makes it look more complete if you don't have big gaps and cracks, but it's really important for keeping water out. And caulking, because of the material that it's made out of, it's flexible. It does degrade over time naturally. A lot of these things get degraded very easily by UV light. So just sun beating down on it. So a lot of times you'll see the side of your house that faces the sun is going to get a lot more cracking in your caulking and paint and everything than the side that doesn't. So making sure that that's kept up on, making sure you don't have big gaps, any areas where you have like plumbing lines or gas lines or electrical lines going in or out of the house, making sure that those are properly sealed and you're really doing what you can to keep the water on the outside of the house. Because a lot of times we can deal with water well when it's on the outside. We can deal with water when we're expecting it on the inside of the house, like our bathrooms and kitchens and everything. But it's when it gets in those places that we don't expect, like inside our walls, that it can really start to create a big issue. So trying to keep it on the outside is definitely going to be very important.
So moving into the house, what do you look for?
Yeah. So,
What are some of the common?
So the first thing, and this is going to be somewhat dependent on your individual climate, but dehumidifiers. So a large number of the mold issues that we see are not necessarily due to water coming in, but they're from humidity that's not being managed well in the home. So especially, again, it's somewhat situational, but most areas of the US, excluding sort of your desert climates, are going to benefit from dehumidification at least some part of the year. For instance, where we are, I have both a whole home dehumidifier as well as a whole home humidifier, because during the winter, whenever we're running our heating system, it gets very dry in the house, which that can cause a lot of problems that aren't really mold related. So we want to make sure we have the humidity added into the home for that. But then during the summer, it gets very, very humid. So that's whenever the humidifier kicks off and the dehumidifier kicks on to make sure that it's kept comfortable, but also that the humidity that we have coming in from the outside isn't going to contribute to an issue. I mean, we saw there's a number of schools, this is probably 3 or 4 years ago now, number of schools in our area basically shut down the HVAC systems completely over the summer to save on heating and cooling bills. And then unsurprisingly, they come back. We had a more moist summer than usual. come back in the fall, try to open up the schools, and there's, boom, immediately that noticeable musty odor. And they had a lot of humidity-based mold growth because they weren't controlling for it in any way. They had shut down the HVAC, and those humidity levels just rise and rise and rise. And if you get enough humidity, you're going to have a mold problem.
That happens over here too in Texas. We had a lot of teachers complaining because as soon as the kids left for the day, they would turn off the HVAC system and the humidity levels would rise, the temperatures would rise. I mean, Texas gets to 100 degrees and it was just, I don't understand why they don't consider the fact that they're creating an environment for mold to grow.
Yeah, it's big. And I mean, your AC system typically will do a good job, especially if you're running it consistently. It'll do a pretty good job of providing some good dehumidification, just because of the way the systems work. They do naturally pull a decent amount of moisture out of the air. But if you're in a humid climate, you really need, in most cases, need to supplement it with additional dehumidification. Either use of I'm a big advocate for whole home dehumidifiers, but even just your standard little, you can find them at Walmart, like the 30-pint standalone dehumidifiers. I mean, where we are, we've got a lot of basements. Again, they get damp very quickly because we've got some pretty moist soil and issues like that. I advocate every single person in our area needs to have a dehumidifier in their basement, period. Doesn't matter when the home was built, doesn't matter what kind of foundation you have, just put one in there. If nothing else, it's cheap insurance, but for the most part, it's going to end up being necessary at some point.
What about, I'm glad you brought up the basements because a lot of people love to finish out their basements. Would you tell them not to do that because basements have a higher chance of having a mold problem if you put sheetrock up or if you put furniture against the wall? Can you kind of give people some tips on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So basements are a tricky situation for sure. We do see a lot of issues with basements, and I wouldn't necessarily advocate against finishing a basement. I mean, I'm actually in my finished basement right now. It's where my home office is. But you do have to be careful whenever you're thinking about doing that. And you got to make sure that anytime you're considering any sort of home improvement or renovation project, you do need to think about moisture issues in general. So you do have to think about your HVAC. You have to think about if water comes in, where's it going to go? And with a subterranean basement, you have to think about water being able to come in and what's going to happen to it. So a lot of it comes down to how you're building it and what products you're using to make sure that you're not creating an issue down the line. The biggest issue we see with finished basements is detection. Obviously, if you have an unfinished basement, it's going to be easier to notice that you've got water coming in and you've got a moisture problem. But if you have a finished basement and you've got drywall and you've got a baseboard, if you think about it, if water's coming in from the foundation wall, it's going to need to wick up basically above the level of the baseboard and all the way through the drywall before you have any visual indicator that there's an issue. And this is one of the things we see very, very commonly. Somebody will call us in because they've got, it's just a few inches. It's maybe like a little 5-inch section or something of the wall right above the baseboard where they've just got, looks like some water damage and maybe a little bit of mold growth on it. And they think that they're being paranoid. They think it's probably a non-issue, or the wife's worried about it and the husband's saying it's no big deal. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. And then sure enough, we get out there and we remove the baseboard and the entire wall underneath and behind the baseboard is just absolutely covered. And then we cut into that wall and everything on the backside is covered because it just takes so long for it to actually move through and materialize on that side where we can see it. So yeah, finished basements can be an issue, but even unfinished basements, again, you just want to think about it. If water's coming in through this wall, even a little bit, how's it going to be able to dry? So a very common problem we see with unfinished basements is they're used heavily for storage. So people will go and they'll store things, and you want to store things in a way that you can still navigate through the space. So what do? Well, they stack up a bunch of cardboard boxes against the foundation walls. And now we've got water coming in through this foundation wall that's then going into a cardboard box, which is a perfect source for mold because it sucks up the water like a sponge, and it's paper-based. So the mold's just going to love eating that. And now, since we've packed them against the foundation, there's no way for air to get through. There's no way for that moisture to dry out naturally. And this is another common problem that we see. They'll go down because they're going through spring cleaning, or they're maybe getting ready to move. So they start to move some of these boxes, and then, oh my God, they discovered this big issue because they've basically created a problem where there's now a situation that mold can grow easily and they're not able to see it. So even just making some really smart choices there, like instead of using cardboard boxes, cardboard boxes are fine for moving. Do not use them for any sort of long-term storage. It's just not a good idea. Go to more of your plastic storage bins. And instead of having things directly on the floor, use shelving units that have an air gap underneath and an air gap on the sides. That way air can get through. So if there is a moisture issue, it's able to, number one, dry out easily. And number two, you're going to be able to detect it a whole lot sooner. Is that where most of these big issues come from that we see, is issues that have been going on for a long time and have gone unnoticed or unaddressed. And a lot of time it's because the homeowners created a situation where they're just not seeing it.
I'm now reevaluating every time we've stored stuff in our garage.
Yeah, garages are bad as well. I mean, you got a ton of humidity in there. You don't generally have, I mean, unless it's subterranean, you don't generally have the foundation issues, but you do have a lot of humidity issues, and you've got no HVAC controls in a garage.
What's kind of the average cost that you find that people spend on mold remediation?
So this is a question that, to be honest, I don't like to answer. I will give you an answer, I promise. But before that, I think it's important to go over, just like it's hard to say what an average mold remediation cost is, it's very hard to say what an average mold issue is, because they can be all over the board. I mean, there's everything from humidity-based issues in bathrooms because people weren't using the bathroom fan. This is something that I'm a huge advocate for. Most people, whenever they think about a bathroom fan, they think that it's for just some of the odors that can occur in a bathroom and mitigating those. But in reality, they're there for humidity. When you shower, you create a ton of excess humidity. Same thing whenever you're boiling water in the kitchen, you're creating a ton of humidity that you're introducing to the environment. In your bathroom, use the exhaust fan there. When you're showering, leave it on for a couple minutes after so it can exhaust it. Same thing in the kitchen, whenever you're cooking, boiling water, okay, throw the exhaust fan on, give that humidity someplace to go that's not just accumulating in your home. So yeah, I mean, the issues that we see are literally all over the place. From a more minor issue that we're going to treat is going to be somewhere in the $800, $850 range for something pretty minor, up to issues can easily go $20, $30, $50,000 plus. It all really depends on what's going on, how significant the issue is, how widespread it is, and also what is the sensitivity of the client, which is one of the biggest factors there, because unfortunately, with mold, no two people are going to react exactly the same. There's some people that are a lot more sensitive to it, and there's some people that are going to have issues with much lower levels of mold than others. Others just seem, I don't know, I'm sure it's a combination, like most things, of biology, genetics, and environment. But everybody is going to react a little bit differently. So for people who are a lot more sensitive, the steps that need to be taken to get the home to a level where they are safe there and they can be comfortable there are going to be more extensive than somebody who's naturally more resistant to it, and who's able to be in an environment that has slightly higher levels. So it really does depend. I mean, I would say on average, our mold treatments are going to be anywhere between $2,000 to about $6,000, somewhere in that range. But it's heavily situational.
In your state, because I know in Texas we have to have a mold assessment before mold remediation begins. In your state, you don't have to do that. So do you generally have a mold assessment before and prior, or do Or does your company go out and do the assessment and then the remediation?
Yeah, so great question. And the answer is both.
Okay.
So there are some circumstances that we do. I mean, we will go out, we do free assessments for our clients and everything. We'll provide that, no problem whatsoever. But generally, if we do, again, it comes down, we're more individual focused than property focused. So if it comes down to somebody who has mold sensitivity or who has some other issues that run in line with the chronic inflammatory response syndrome, Lyme's disease, those kind of things, we will strongly advocate that they get somebody else in to take a look at it, to perform a full assessment, do some more testing. There's a few different people that we work with in our area that we've got great working relationships with that are truly experts in the field. And we love having their input because they're able to give us an additional, if nothing else, an additional trained set of eyes on it that can maybe help see some things that we could have missed and give some insights that we might not have on our own. So we really advocate that they utilize those third-party sources as well to help inform and give the best possible solutions to the problem.
When you get that third-party report from that mold inspector, do you charge to give somebody a quote for the mold remediation, or is that free?
No, it's free for customer clients in our area and everything. We don't charge for those. We do generally do an on-site assessment. We're not typically going to quote based off of just what the mold inspector or assessor sees.
Okay.
We don't. In some cases we can, and we have, particularly if it's a real estate transaction and somehow we just got the report and they're or the due diligence period or whatever is ending in a day and we don't have time to get out there, we can do that. But really, we want to try to get eyes on it anytime we can, especially if it's a more significant issue, to just really identify, do we think that the mold assessor got everything right? Do we think that maybe there's some additional things that need to be done or at least need to be considered? And if nothing else, to make sure we're in alignment with the client. That's something we're really big on, is goals and alignment. Unfortunately, the kind of industry standards for what's an acceptable level of mold is, number one, poorly defined, and number two, not applicable for every individual. I mean, the one of the most common ones we hear and do utilize in some cases is the normal fungal ecology, basically looking at air sampling and making sure that the levels are consistent with what's in the outdoor air. And there's some good validity to that, and there's some challenges with that as well. But at the end of the day, in a lot of cases, that's not going to be good enough for somebody who has a sensitivity to mold. So we need to figure out, what exactly do they need? What are we trying to achieve through this process? And then going back to the assessor's report, do we think that's going to get us there? Or do we think there are extra steps that need to be taken as well?
I'm curious, because in the state of Texas, we have to issue what's called the Certificate of Mold Damage Remediation whenever we go in to perform a post-assessment before containment's taken down, to verify that remediation was indeed done successfully, there wasn't cross-contamination, and so forth.
Yep.
What's the process like over there in your state whenever you're done with remediation? Is a post-assessment performed? Is there some type of certificate that's given?
So in short, no. It is the Wild West, and it's something that is deeply problematic. And unfortunately, Texas is relatively one of the few states that actually has some fairly stringent guidelines, and there are benefits and drawbacks to those, to be sure. I think in most cases, it's probably more good than bad. But I'm a little bit hesitant to be a huge advocate for governmental guidelines because, again, and I understand why they try to make everything very one size fits all, which can be limiting too. Because as we talked about with individuals' mold sensitivities, they're not one size fits all, and what works for some doesn't work for others. So it can be a little bit of handcuffs there. But on the flip side, going to somewhere like Pennsylvania, where there's basically no restrictions. I mean, if you have if you can get insurance and a home improvement contractor's license, which basically requires you to file with the state and pay a small fee to the state to file. And you have to have the insurance. Once you have those, you can set up as a home improvement contractor and you can call yourself a mold remediator. And you can do kind of whatever you want. And unfortunately, it does create some companies that are just going to come in and use exclusively products. They're just going to do chemical application and that's it. And they're going to use some testing methods. Mold testing is such a challenging topic because anytime we're talking about testing, we want there to be, this is the test that we do and it is valid and it works well. And unfortunately, as you guys know, there's a variety of different mold tests available. They all have some benefits and they all have some pretty significant drawbacks. And there's definitely nothing that is a concrete, this is the test for mold. But whenever you get into some of these areas, like I'm guessing Texas, they're doing it all based on air sampling. I'm not intimately familiar with their, it's visual. What are the thresholds or the protocols for determining post-remediation verification?
So the most important part is we don't do any testing for the post until we've gone through and we've procedurally and visually identified that there is no more elevated levels of moisture content anywhere. There's no more visible mold growth or hidden mold growth. There's no more problems that could cause moisture to then develop mold growth to start occurring again. And then if all that passes, then we move on to the analytical part, because there's no reason to do testing if there's still a problem and just charge more money to the client when we see that there's still a problem. So when we find that out, we go back and we write up the amendments of what still needs to be done. Then we return, start all over again. And no, when it comes to testing, air sampling, as you know, is very flawed and limited. So there's other samples that we will do as well in addition to air sampling. But one of our favorite is the white cloths that we use that are sterile. They're not like the ERMI. But we will use it also.
Is it then doing like a visual assessment or a visual count of spores? So sort of like a tape lift or swab sample would?
Yes.
Okay.
But it
that makes sense.
Collects more square feet around the house and in those areas. Because we've got into a containment area before, and we did this test where we did an air sample where we just walked in, and the mold that we were dealing with was Stachybotrys. And that air sample,
heavy and sticky. It's not going to come up air. Yeah, I mean, a lot of cases, it's not going to come up on air.
Well, I think only 5 spores came up, but then we went back in and we airbrushed the contained area, and then all of a sudden it was like 300,000 spores of Stachy. So had that remediator brought down that containment, those spores, now it's just what we captured in our cassette, would have now gone into the indoor environment. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a variety of different testing methodologies. At the end of the day, it needs to be testing with some combination of approaches that they're using. Getting back to the situation in PA, we do have some people who are using ATP testing as a instant mold test, that's not what it is. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said that's interesting.
Yeah. So ATP testing is basically it's generally used in mostly in restaurant situations. It's used by health inspectors to verify clean surfaces for food contact. It's basically making sure that the restaurants are not prepping your meals on dirty prep areas. The problem is we have companies that are literally using this as a instant read for mold and providing information to the customer that's not entirely accurate. That, okay, well, if it tests positive, that means, number one, it uses a lot of language that I don't like hazmat suit required. And there's a variety of different other terms that they use that are very fear mongering. But they're also using a test that in theory can detect mold, but it's definitely not exclusively detecting mold, and that doesn't mean that's what you're finding. And they're using this for both in their pre-test to justify the necessity of having services done. And then they're also using it for their own post-test clearance, which is however you feel about testing or post-testing. If you're going to have clearances done, it needs to be by a third party, period. It's not a place for the individual remediator to do. We will occasionally pull samples on our own jobs throughout the course of the progress and towards the end of it to make sure that we're where we need to be. But that's not something we're going to do and hand to the client as, oh yeah, we did our job. It's not ethical in our minds.
I have a lot of respect for that. We've talked to many people where they've worked with remediators that have done that. And we always, both Emily and I are very big on that's not helpful. Like you want to protect yourself. So that shows a lot of credibility for your company.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I would much rather, we want to know that we're handing over a clean, good space. So like I said, we will occasionally pull our own sampling and everything to make sure that that's good. Particularly if the customer doesn't want third-party verification testing done for whatever reason. But we always advocate that they have that done by a third party and know that the issue's been addressed fully, and it's not just us saying that. So, but yeah, it does, going back to the regulatory side of it, it does create some real issues because there's basically no barriers to people getting into the space and claiming that they're doing mold remediation and then doing a variety of different things, from everything from just going and spraying some chemicals on it and then calling it good, or going in and just ripping something out with no containment and then throwing up some kills and saying, okay, you're good to go. So it's definitely something that people need to be aware of whenever they're looking at having something done. And at the end of the day, you gotta vet it. You gotta vet the companies that you're looking at. You need to go through, look at reviews, ask for references, and make sure that what they're saying they're going to do is what they're going to do.
What are some other things, we're just going to tag on that for a minute. What are some other things you would have people do in vetting a company or when they're looking for a company to use for remediation?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing I would do to touch on what we were just talking about, I would check with your state and see what their requirements are. If there are requirements for them to be trained or certified or anything like that in the individual in that particular space or not, look for any sort of third-party certifications that they might have. ACAC is a great one. ICRC obviously offers a variety of different ones. Theirs are a little bit more insurance focused than I would like, but whereas ACAC tends to be more on the general air quality and environmental quality side. So personally, I'm a bigger advocate for theirs, but, and then going through, look at reviews, ask for and contact references. Do that 100% of the time. It drives me crazy. I mean, we have, if a client contacts us and asks for references, we ask every client at the end of the service if they would be willing to be a reference for future customers. And talk to them about their experience with us. And as a result, we've got a list of, I think it's at like 500 or something, different people that they can contact that we can then sort down to, okay, this person also had an issue with their attic, which is what you're dealing with. So we're going to give you other people who had attic issues, or they've had a basement problem. So they can help really communicate what the experience was working with us. And I think in general, I mean, anytime I'm looking at a contractor for any kind of work I'm having done in my house, I'm always going to ask for references because I want to know, okay, can we at least find a few people that are going to say good things about you? And then I'm going to ask specific questions about the experience because I want to know, is it just their brother-in-law that you're contacting, or is it somebody who's an actual client? What did they go through? What was the experience like? How was the communication back and forth? One of the big things for me is somewhat on the vetting side before you even contact, but more so throughout the contact portion of it. So generally, whenever somebody's looking to have some work done, whether it be a mold remediation project or a different one, they're almost always going to contact more than one company. And I think you should. And throughout that, you're going to learn a lot about the company during that process. So how are they answering the phones? How responsive are they to communication? What are they showing up on time? Because if they're not showing up whenever they say they're supposed to come and do an assessment, what does that tell you about how they're going to execute on the other things they say they're going to do throughout the process? It's not a great way to start off the communication. So really using those, and if you see red flags throughout that process, that's an indicator that you should be looking for somebody else. So, I mean, vetting thoroughly, starting with your state and licensing boards and everything. Ask about insurance and have them provide certificates of insurance. It's something that a lot of customers don't do, and they should, because you want to make sure that they are actively insured, so that if anything does happen, I mean, it's not that hard to imagine somebody coming in to do a mold remediation project and causing a much more significant issue than what they started with. And if they're not licensed and insured, you can, I guess, try to take them to court or something. But as the old saying goes, you can't get blood from a stone. So good luck with that. I mean, if they're a contractor that's operating without insurance, chances are you're not going to have much in the way of a remedy there. So, yeah, I mean, that's really the big stuff. Checking whatever you can for your third-party certifications, licensing, insurance, and referrals, references, really going through that to understand what the experience is going to be like.
I would add to that too, something you already said for people that are listening and are chemically sensitive. I would ask what their procedures are, if they have different procedures for people that are chemically sensitive.
Yes. Yep.
Because that's a big one.
Yeah.
Just on the end result side of things, if you're living in the home, you want to know if they're going to be doing something different.
Yeah, and something like I said, we really try to communicate this well with our clients, and I think it's something that should be more prevalent in the industry at large. How will success be measured for this project, or what are the goals of the project? Because again, if we're going like in Texas, you obviously have your whole post-remediation verification process. But what if that's not good enough for the client? What if they are still having issues afterwards? Or what if that qualification could have been met even prior to any work being done, but the client's just got that level of sensitivity? Now what are you going to do? What are you looking at? So I think it's really important to just know and trust who you're working with, and make sure that your goals are aligned and you're working towards the same objective.
I think you just brought up a very good point, Tim, because I go over this a lot with people. And whenever the whole post-assessment, and let's say everything's cleared, and they move back in and they are still having health issues, that's where they really have to rely on their doctor to see, are their markers going up or are they going down? Are they detoxing? Is it just that now their body is detoxing and they're having these symptoms be exaggerated because of it? So, and then some clients, unfortunately, because of the trauma that they experienced in the home itself, it doesn't matter how clean it is, they cannot stay in it. It's PTSD, it's traumatized their whole life, and they just literally have to move. But we have a lot of clients that because of how sick that they are, whenever they get out of the environment, they're detoxing for a while. And it's not that they're being re-exposed, it's just that their body's now able to start dumping toxins. And there was a study done by Real Time Labs that showed, I think it was around month 4, that's when the majority of the urine mycotoxin test went up, like doubled and tripled in the people, because that's when it was like pretty much on average when the body was able to finally just start really dumping. Because so medically, I usually ask the people if they've had their markers checked, or if their doctors can tell them if they are improving or not, just based on their lab results.
Yep. Yeah, and that's really huge. And just again, it's about being in lockstep with whoever it is that you're working with, So you guys, everybody understands what we're working towards, what challenges we're expecting. And there are some cases, especially with people who are highly sensitive to mold, that we'll flat out tell them, hey, these are the processes that we can do, and here's what we think we're going to achieve. But whenever you get to certain levels, I mean, it can just be really difficult if you're trying to get things significantly lower than what things are in the natural environment. There's definitely a point where it can be exceedingly challenging there. And working with them and understanding budgetary issues is a huge challenge here, because at the end of the day, like using ERMI for an example, and I don't know exactly what your stance is on ERMI. Obviously, it can be relatively contentious in the industry at large. The challenge with guaranteeing like a passing ERMI, because of the way that it's collected and the various collection methods and everything, to truly guarantee a passing ERMI test requires extremely extensive work to be done on the home, to the point where it's just not practical for most people to go through the level of work that is required to absolutely guarantee that. I mean, we're talking full removal of every single soft surface. We're talking removal of pretty much all HVAC components in general, definite removal of all flex duct throughout the home, removal of all contents, everything. And at the end of the day, there's some people that will say, yes, absolutely, that's what I want to do. Let's go for it and make sure that happens. But for a lot of people, that's just not reality. So it's about figuring out, okay, what are the steps that we can take to get things as good as they can get, given what constraints we're looking at. So it's all about that level of communication and just making sure that everybody's working towards the same goals there.
Elizabeth and I were having a conversation with a person. Well, we're going to announce them later, but
it'll go public.
But he was saying basically the same thing you were saying. Not only that, ERMIs can also come pre-contaminated. So who's to say that ERMI wasn't already contaminated, and that's what you're finding whenever you send them back in. I think the ERMI is a really good sample. We don't use it because obviously it can be pre-contaminated. It will be thrown out of court immediately. We use our own sterile wipes, but they are. I think the ERMI is a really good sample for those who want to test their own home. But the numbers, the scoring, we don't look at that. We look at what shows up.
Yeah, I mean, we're generally, whenever we get an ERMI sample in, what we're really looking at there is it's giving us an indication of the history of the property, the history of the issues that have been there. We don't really look at it to figure out active growth or anything along those lines. And a big part of that's the collection methodology too. With it, the vast majority of ERMI tests that we see are collected by individuals, and their range of where it's acceptable to sort of pull one sample and then it gets all collected together and just analyzed with one final result. From a remediation perspective, it just doesn't really give a lot of actionable info that we can go off of, but it does give us a history of what has been present there over time.
Well, Tim, I know we want to make sure people can get a hold of you and learn more about you. But before we do that, real quick, I need to thank one of our corporate sponsors. IBW Local 66 is one of our tier sponsors, and they're located out of Pasadena, Texas. They were chartered on January 13th, 1894. For over the last 125 years, IBW Local Union 66 has represented skilled craftsmen in the electrical industry. Today, we have a membership of 4,300 men and women working in many crafts related to generation, distribution, maintenance, and operation of the electrical grid. They are the ones that are going in after every hurricane in Houston and the surrounding Texas area and making sure everybody has power. My family are actually members of Local 66, so I'm incredibly proud that they are one of our tier 1 corporate sponsors. So you can check them out. Their information and links are all on our website. Tim, thank you. This has been a lot of fun. This has just been a really fun interview for us. And we want to make sure people can contact you. Where can they find more about you and your company?
Absolutely. So best place is online, www.moldmedics.com. Or you can find info about our franchising opportunities at moldmedicsfranchising.com. So we're currently based in Pittsburgh, but we are looking to continue to spread through franchising. So if anybody's looking to open up their own business, I wouldn't recommend it for somebody who's mold sensitive for obvious reasons. But if you know someone who is, there's some great opportunity there.
Perfect. Thank you so much.